Good morning and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. So today we're going to be talking about a push that was happening in Alabama to rethink driver's license suspensions, which supporters of this push say keep poverty in place. They keep low-level offenses capable of upending people's lives in a sort of constant and ongoing way. Now, Alabama, like many other states, is a state where drivers can have their licenses suspended as a punishment for things that have nothing to do with driving. So things like child support issues, unrelated drug charges, failure to pay certain court fines and fees. And once your driver's license is suspended, you have to pay serious money to get it back, which if you don't have that money leads to either very difficult choices or just total upending of a person's life. Now, a 2018 report by Alabama Appleseed Center for Law and Justice found that 89% of people with suspended licenses reported being forced to choose between basic needs and paying what they owed. Now, this makes sense because driving is especially essential in a state like Alabama, where public transportation is limited and a person's ability to work or access necessities or school or medical appointments is contingent on them being able to get there by car. But even if you want to pay off a fine and get your license back, it's not that simple. Think of it this way. To make the money you would need to get your license reinstated, you got to go to work. But now you can't drive legally to work because your license is suspended. And if you drive anyway, because you just think you got to make it to work and you get pulled over, which of course is much more likely if you are Black or brown in America, that means getting into serious trouble, picking up new criminal charges, possibly getting taken to jail and owing more money and missing work because you're in jail because you were trying to get to work. As a former public defender, I can say this is not speculative. I have represented people who got into this very bind. A license suspension for something unrelated to driving, trying to get to work, getting arrested for trying to go to work, and losing their job because they were in jail sitting in on that arrest. This, of course, leads to what I think of as shrapnel in a person's life. It can cost a person their job, which can cost a person their housing. Sometimes their child custody, family unity is an issue here. The loss of medical continuity, medical care, the ability to care for loved ones, not to mention just the sheer trauma of being arrested and put in jail and the possible threat to a person's life, given what we've seen, in terms of the danger of a police encounter for Black and brown Americans. Now, all of this, remember, started with a minor offense or an unpaid fee that can turn into a devastating cycle that just serves as this perpetual punishment on the basis of poverty. But there was a bill in Alabama, HB 129, that would have disrupted that cycle by preventing the state from suspending driver's licenses for many of these little reasons that have nothing to do with driving. Suspensions for more serious crimes, including driving under the influence, would still have been permitted. Joining me now to talk about this legislation and how driver's licenses just sort of fit into this ecosystem of the criminalization of poverty are Leah Nelson, research director at Alabama Appleseed, and Jerry Wiley, a retired police captain for the Birmingham Police Department. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So before we get into the specifics of the bill, I wanted to sort of take a step back and talk about how the system currently operates. Jerry, you spent decades as a police officer, and you recently, a police captain. I should stop saying officer because I got to get the rank right. But you recently wrote about the way that driver's license suspensions and other forms of traffic enforcement effectively serve to make poverty a crime in Alabama. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that dynamic and how you saw it play out day to day during your time on the police force.
Thanks for that introduction, by the way. I'm 30 years with the Birmingham Police Department. I retired 5 years ago. But prior to that, but even before I made captain, I figured out as a lieutenant in probably one of the busiest precincts in the state of Alabama, which was a high poverty type precinct, as most of them usually are. I realized that a lot of our officers were spending so much time on these traffic tickets and minor stops and everything, and ended up, again, I realized they're writing tickets for these minor offenses that really didn't matter a whole lot to our crime fighting efforts, and it was taking so much time away from us. So what I did, especially, I tried to do it a little bit as a lieutenant. I don't have a whole lot of control as a lieutenant, but when I became the captain over the precinct, I decided I was going to do something about it. And I actually told our guys to quit or de-emphasize writing all those tickets. I didn't tell them to quit making the stops, but there's just no point in writing the tickets as I wrote in my piece, to a single mother who's doesn't have has an expired tag. Well, she has an expired tag because she couldn't afford to pay for the tag to begin with, and then we stopped for this low hanging fruit, as some of the officers like to say, because it's easy. She's not going to give us any flack or anything. I can make my a daily production, so to speak, and maybe we'll get lucky and we'll have an arrest out of it. And generally, that's what happens. This is what I mean by, and you described it perfectly. This continuing spiral downward of fines and fees and losing my license, and really all I'm trying to do is go to work or take my kids to my mother's house so she can watch the kids because I can't have paid for childcare, and this whole thing is happening. And I'm not going to go to court. The thing in Alabama is you get your license suspended. One of the things is for not going to court. Well, I'm not going to court because I'm afraid if I go to court and I can't pay my fines, which I can't do, then they're going to put me in jail. So what I do is I just roll the dice, like you said, and hope I never get stopped. Well, that's not going to happen either because, like you said, I've got a whole bunch of police officers driving around the community she lives in looking for low-hanging fruit. So in the way I looked at it, it was a way to keep police officers on the street to prevent the crimes that we're trying to prevent to begin with. So I just told my guys to quit doing it. Sometimes when I would hear them on the radio, they would run somebody and I'd hear that, the person had warrants for, outstanding fines. That's usually what they used to say, failure to appear and stuff like that. I would literally get on the radio and say, advise them they have warrants, get back in service. I need you on the street. So that's kind of what I did in the beginning. As I progressed through my career, let's just say, I realized even though that was let's just say a good way to keep officers on the street, maybe to have more production, I also realized that what we were doing was we creating criminals out of a whole lot of people who, like I said in my piece, their only crime was that they were in poverty.
Thank you so much for framing it that way. And I also appreciate that you brought up the innocuousness of the warrants, because it's a point I've been trying to talk. A lot of people who are not familiar with this world think of warrants as being like this inherently dangerous thing. Oh my goodness, this person had a warrant. But so often the warrant really is for like an unpaid ticket, and you're not doing harm to public safety by saying to the person, hey, you should go to court and clear this up. Like that actually is enough. So I'm really glad you touched on that.
I want to add one more thing, if you'd let me interrupt.
Yeah.
There's this especially here in Birmingham, Liam may know, we had a person unfortunately killed in a police chase last week, as a matter of fact, an innocent person. And there's a lot of the public and some law enforcement will tell you, well, we have to chase these people because they're dangerous criminals. Well, I will tell you from my experience of 30 years, the vast majority of the people who run for the police are running because, one, they got some minor outstanding warrants on them, not because they're a homicide or want for that or anything else serious. They just don't want to go to jail at that second. So they will try to run, try to get away, and that's the vast majority of what police chases are over. So, and so that's another reason. If we just stop doing a lot of it, I want to stop a whole lot of the stops to begin with. But there's another.
I'm going to circle back to you on that because I want to talk about that. And yeah, I admit when I think about if somebody was going to take me away from my daughter and I might have to be separated from her, I'd run too. All right, so Leah, I want to go to you for the research side of this because you've done phenomenal research on this issue with Alabama Appleseed. And I'm wondering if you could tell us about what the data show about sort of the system of driver's license suspensions in Alabama and who's hurt the most by it and what does that harm actually manifest as?
Great. Thank you so much for asking. And Jerry, thank you for bringing it home about the warrants because that is a huge problem that sends a lot of people to jail. So in 2018, I led a research project that surveyed nearly 1,000 people in Alabama about their experiences with fines and fees. Now we surveyed people who had fines and fees for all kinds of reasons, including traffic debt all the way up to felonies. But then we drilled down into the experiences of people who only owed debt for traffic violations and whose licenses had been suspended. Now, I should say there are 4 major reasons that have nothing to do with road safety that your license can be suspended in Alabama. Your license can be suspended for failure to pay traffic debt, for failure to appear at a hearing about that traffic debt. So very often, if you can't pay everything you owe all at once, you'll get put on a payment plan, and also you'll be expected to come in for compliance hearings, check in with the judge, and explain how you're doing. If you miss one of those hearings, a warrant is issued, and that can trigger your license to be suspended and also jail time, as Jerry just alluded to. You can have your license suspended in connection with simple possession of drugs. So, for instance, if you were having, really serious back pain, and your next door neighbor had Vicodin and gave you 1 Vicodin to deal with that back pain, and you were arrested, you're going to get a felony and your license is going to be suspended for 6 months. You can also have your license suspended for unpaid child support, both in Alabama and everywhere in the country. That is a federal problem that requires a federal solution. We're not able to deal with that at a state level because of federal funding restrictions. So lots and lots of people have their licenses suspended. At last check, for the reasons I just enumerated, about 100,000 people in Alabama had their licenses suspended for those reasons. We don't have racial data on whose licenses are suspended, but we know that traffic stops disproportionately impact people of color, and particularly African American people in Alabama. So we can assume that if we looked at the racial breakdown, that we would see African Americans overrepresented in that 100,000 people whose licenses are suspended. And part of the reason for that is Alabama's racial wealth gap, right? Because if you have access to wealth, either your own bank account or you can call a family member and they can pay off your traffic debt, then you don't end up with a license suspension. But if you don't have money in the bank or you don't have a family member that can help you out, then you're more likely to end up with your license suspended, not because you're more dangerous, but because you have less money. So the impact of these license suspensions is wide ranging. Like you mentioned, Emily, 89% of my sample had to choose between paying for a basic need like rent or utilities or prescription medication and servicing their debt to the state so they could keep their licenses. 73% of them had to request charity, which is humiliating and also drains funds that are intended to help people who can't help themselves. Now, if you can't drive, you can't help yourself, but a lot of people would much rather live independently and not be going to a food bank. Nearly half of the people I surveyed who had lost their licenses had taken out a high-cost payday loan or title loan in order to service their debt. Now, in Alabama, those loans can carry 456% APRs. So we are talking about incurring staggering debt so that you can keep your driver's license. And a lot of people didn't keep their licenses. 64% of them were jailed in connection with unpaid traffic debt. And 30% of them actually admitted to committing a more serious crime, like selling drugs or stealing or selling their bodies in order to pay off their debt to the state. So I want to give you an example from someone that I spoke with actually just yesterday who was pulled over in a small North Alabama town. She didn't realize she had $124 of outstanding debt. She was pulled over in September 2020 as the COVID pandemic was raging. And she was taken into custody. She didn't even know that there was an outstanding warrant for her arrest. A letter had been apparently sent to her home, but she hadn't received it because she was in the middle of a move. No one had made an attempt to call her or text her or let her know that she owed them money. She actually did have the money. She could have paid. She had $124 on her at the time of her traffic stop, but the system is not set up to allow her to pay. So she's taken to jail and actually spent a night in jail in September 2020 with no personal protective equipment for $124 in traffic debt that she was not permitted to pay, even though she had it. She endured a strip search. I mean, during a pandemic over traffic debt. And I have spoken with so many people like that. They are so frightened of traffic stops. They are so frightened of going to jail, and for good reason, because even when there's not a pandemic, going to jail can trigger job loss. It can cause you to lose your home. It can cause the Department of Human Resources, that's our Child Protective Service agency, to get involved in your business and, inquire whether you're a fit parent, if you're a single parent, for instance. It triggers all of these collateral consequences. We need to stop suspending people's licenses, but we do need to also think about the impact of traffic stops and whether it makes sense to jail people for what are fundamentally debt-related reasons.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because the more I think about this, the more I'm thinking about this through the lens of harm and safety and what the government is doing to its people and whether it's creating harm or safety. And I feel like I want to go into the specifics, Leah, with you of HB 129. But before we do, I want to turn back to Jerry for a second, because in all of those years of police experience, I know you've seen a lot of sort of very individual situations, and also a lot of instances where government policies make situations worse instead of better. And I'm wondering if you could speak to, some of the most common forms of, I'm just realizing that Jerry is not on our screen. I just looked down. Jerry, are you there, and can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I just can't see you. It's like the lights went out. Oh, there you are. Fabulous. Okay. You're back. So I just wanted to ask you, to speak a little bit to people who might oppose reform this and say, well, I don't want criminals having a license. I don't want criminals driving on the road. I want police to how do you respond to people who think that this is good policy, or to government legislators who think this is good policy?
Well, here's my thing to the government legislatures. The purpose of having a driver's license is to make sure that everybody who's out driving on the streets, licensed, have proper insurance here in Alabama and probably the rest of the country now, I assume, and that they're leaders. Well, the fact of the matter is they're just not. Again, just because they get their license suspended, as we all know, they're going to keep driving. So we're not preventing anything. I think it's an almost a purposeful intent on some people. I don't know how to say it any other way. The legislatures know people are going to continue to drive. They know this. So, in my opinion, they have to purposely know that we're just going to keep piling more and more debt on these people. The issue with that is, the state of Alabama, the Department of Public Safety, they get a lot of money from reinstatement of these driver's licenses. I think Leah's told me that it was $2 million a year, and that in the House bill was trying to replace some money. But they're not paying those fines anyway, in that you're fining people and you're doing all this stuff, but you're not getting the money anyway. So they're just incurring this debt that, frankly, I don't think they'll ever get paid. I think we in the city of Birmingham one time, we researched it. Of all the tickets that Birmingham police officers wrote over a year and something, I think the municipal court dismissed 60% of them just because people couldn't pay. So that means 60% of what our police officers were doing in a given year was just pointless. And again, it's just a whole lot of work. When I talk to my fellow law enforcement people, legislatures, when they're really worried about crime, to me, if my police officers are committing so much of their time to this, it's just a public safety issue with me. If my police officer is in the jail, spending the jail, and it takes 20 minutes, and then the police officer's back on the street, it's generally about a 3 or 4 hour experience for the police officer to go take the person to jail, book them in the jail, go to a magistrate, obtain the warrants for whatever that was, and then get them back on the street. I've lost that police officer for 4 hours. Or if I got 5 police officers out of my 20 police officers that I have all doing this, I look at it. To me, it's a crime issue. In my heart, I know it's a poverty issue, but when I try to sell it to people, I think I can sell it better as a crime issue, and that's the way I like to go about it and look at it. So if I can convince them to do the right thing for the wrong reason, sometimes that's okay with me too.
I hear you on that strategy. And Leah, I want to go to you for a second to talk about HB 129 because, I mean, I'm sitting here listening to a career police officer tell me about how bad the current policy is. And I feel it is rare that we end up with public defenders and police officers totally agreeing about a particular policy question. So I'm wondering, HB 129 is dead for now, but will be back. And I'm wondering if you could talk us through what the bill would have done and what it's going to take to get this bill back before the legislature and when Alabamans might be able to see some change.
Right. So HB 129 is only dead because our legislative session has like 2.5 days left in it, and we just didn't get it out this year. There was a lot going on with COVID, but I am very optimistic that it will be back in a similar form next year. We had a really strong sponsor who was a Republican who owns a construction business, who had actually seen where guys that he trained and trusted were not able to show up for work because they lost their licenses. And that's a really common thing, right? Anybody whose job requires them to be on the job, so a plumber, an HVAC person, a maintenance guy, a landscaping guy, all these people, anybody who has to show up for work, and especially if you need to drive for work, you can't do your job if you don't have a driver's license. And we look at a gig economy, right? One bill that just got passed last night that everyone's excited about is wine delivery. We're now going to have that in Alabama. We have joined the 21st century. Well, if you want wine delivered to your home, someone's going to have to deliver it. That person's going to need to be a driver with a license. So I expect there's going to be enthusiasm and momentum behind this bill next year. What HB 129 would have done was end suspensions for unpaid debt, so unpaid traffic debt, end suspensions for failure to appear at a compliance hearing about unpaid traffic debt. Now, if you didn't appear at a court hearing that was the preliminary hearing for a manslaughter charge, you could still have your license suspended under this bill. But if you didn't go to a compliance hearing to say why you missed a payment or how you were doing on a payment, you could not have your license suspended. And then it would have ended Alabama's practice of suspending licenses for those simple drug convictions. I think we are one of only 3 or 4 jurisdictions nationally that still does that. And it is well behind time for us to catch up with our sister states. If Mississippi can do it, surely Alabama can do it. So we had a ton of momentum this year and an incredible coalition that I am so proud of. We had businesses behind us. So Mercedes-Benz, which is one of the largest employers in the state, wants people at its car plants. And if it wants people to get to work, it knows they have to have licenses. A major steel company, Sable Steel, also wants people to be able to get to work. Americans for Tax Reform, which is a sort of libertarian-leaning good government group, recognizes that fines and fees like this are actually a hidden form of tax. They are how we fund our state, and they disproportionately impact the people who are least able to pay. So the Conservative Americans for Tax Reform group was on our side here. We had people who advocate for victims of domestic violence who recognize that women who are trapped in a dangerous relationship need financial independence in order to escape from those dangerous relationships. And to have financial independence, you need a bank account, which you can't start without the most trusted form of ID. You need to be able to get a job, which is awfully difficult to get if you don't have a driver's license. And you need to be able to literally physically get away. I have personally spoken with women who are in dangerous relationships where their partner controlled the finances, where they were unable to get away because their license was suspended. This is very real and very personal. And of course, we have the civil and human rights organizations on our side. So this is quite a strong coalition. And we'll be back next year.
That is such a powerful coalition you just described. I'm speechless. And there's some little part of my heart that says, hey, there's 2.5 days left. Maybe somebody will take it up in 2.5 days. It's like more than 50 something hours left. But in any event, thank you both so much for joining us to talk about this important issue. I would love to continue this conversation. And I hope you will both come back on the show to update us on what's happening on this and on other forms of advancements that can transform the relationship between low-income Alabamans and their state. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We just heard about a law created as a choice, a policy choice by government legislators in Alabama, but also in many, many, many other states, that imposes a burden on its citizens. It says the state's going to impose debts on you for little things you might have done wrong, or little things that might have been a completely ordinary misstep. And that debt is going to force you, as we heard from Leah, to take out 400% APR loans, to go without food or medicine, to choose between your kids and your court debt, to have your life put at risk by being put in jail during a pandemic with no protective equipment, to be forced to commit a new, more serious crime. Leah described as selling drugs or selling one's body, engaging in sex work in order to pay a debt to the state. These are things that research shows people in Alabama are actually having to do right now because of a government policy that should have perhaps been changed during this legislative session, but which Leah does not have much hope for. And we heard from, I think this is really rare on the show, that we've got a strong police voice telling us about how bad this policy is, not just for Alabamans, but for police officers who want to spend their time on more serious crime, for police officers who don't want to be debt collectors, who don't want to be operating as violent agents of the state, forcing somebody to come in on a warrant for something small. We touched on this in the show, but we are reminded of this incredibly important issue by Walter Scott, who was killed in Charleston running from police because of unpaid alimony. Nobody should be losing their life in this context. We need to make change that is literally a life and death issue for Black and brown Americans, Black and brown Alabamans, who are forced to make these horrifying choices by the current policies of their elected government. Now, I know not all of this falls on the state government in Alabama. Some of these are federal policy choices. Some of these is the federal policy of suspending people's driver's licenses for unpaid child support, and that needs to change too. But the point is, as Jerry, I believe, pointed out, the government knows people are going to keep driving. The government knows that these court debts are forcing people, or these fines and fees, these suspensions based on debt are forcing people into making horrifying choices. And those choices are caused by a government choosing to try and squeeze a little bit of money out of its poorest citizens. So who's against this? This is trying to squeeze blood from a stone. Who's against this? Well, libertarians, big industry, researchers, experts, survivors of domestic violence, human rights organizations, and employers are all telling the government that this needs to change in Alabama. And this policy needs to change wherever it is. Yet here we are having a conversation about how this bill does not have a lot of hope of passing in the next 2.5 days. I still want to hold out hope that change can happen. And I hope you do too. So thanks for joining us here on The Appeal Live. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. See you soon.